We used to work together at a nonpartisan think tank in Washington, D.C. called the Center for New American Security, where Kristen was the vice president and head of research and studies and all the things, which basically meant she used to edit everything that I wrote.
He loved
so
it.
I loved it. That was the best part. She's had a bunch of different leadership roles in other think tanks, including the U.S. Institute for Peace, Brookings. She's been at GW. She's worked at the State Department. She's currently on the board of a board member of the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition. But since 2014, she has been at IREX, where she is currently the CEO. And for those of you who don't know, IREX is one of the world's leading nonprofits focusing on development issues, and it's much broader than that, but Kristen can tell you about their work. And today, Kristen's going to be talking to us about strategies for addressing various forms of disinformation. Not that that's a problem that we have around here. But in any case, it's a pleasure to see all of you at CSAC, and it's great to welcome Kristen. So as normal, Kristen will talk at us for a bit, and then we will open it up for conversation and questions. Okay?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Colin, and thanks to all of you for being here. I really appreciate it. Colin mentioned that if I was ever back in the Bay Area and wanted to give a talk, to let him know. So he probably didn't expect me to email him back more than a year later and take him up on it. But I'm coming with an agenda. My agenda is not to show you how I have great new insights and research and findings that will wow and enlighten you. My primary agenda, I hope I have some things to share that will be of interest to you. My primary agenda, though, is to show you how little we know about a very important topic and hopefully spark some brilliant minds here at Stanford, some of whom I already know, these two gentlemen to my right, and many of your colleagues, and see if we can get a lot more people focused on what I think is an understudied dimension of the disinformation problem. So as Colin said, I'm going to give you a really brief overview first, just to ground you in my understanding of this issue of disinformation, and then also talk about building citizen response and citizen resilience to disinformation, which I think has to be part of the issue. And then I hope we can have a conversation, and like I said, I hope we can talk about the research that needs to be done on this issue and isn't. So if you don't mind, I'm going to stand over here just so I can see both the PowerPoint and you. But Colin, thank you again for inviting me. You're all extremely lucky to have him here. We miss him in Washington, D.C., but since I live there now, I understand why he left. Sure. All right, whoops. Adobe apparently needs to be updated. I think I'm going to remind you later, CSAC. Okay, so this is an overly long title, but basically my focus here is to talk about the citizen side of the equation. How do you build citizen resilience to disinformation when the cost of producing disinformation is effectively zero? That is what we're going to talk about today. And I was really pleased to see this book, for instance, by a friend of Colin's of mine, Peter Singer, which, as many of you know, Peter, my former colleague at Brookings and a colleague at New America, who's now partnering with IREX on this issue. I mean, he and his co-author, Emerson Brookings, they're security experts. And they have an entire book, as many others do, I'm just zeroing in on this as an example, really talking about not just how the weaponization of social media is a national security threat, a threat to the very foundations of democracy, but also something that is wildly understudied. And what really got my attention, though, is at the very end, in that chapter that's supposed to be on what do we do now and recommendations, they actually do talk about media literacy. And that's the main topic of my talk. And to me, that really stood out because most of the time when you hear national security or defense experts speak, they're talking about weapons systems or maybe information campaigns or strategic communications campaigns, and they mean a certain kind of thing by that. But I think that Peter and Emerson were really right to focus in on the citizen side because it is ultimately the fact that the cost of producing disinformation is so low, it is getting more and more sophisticated, and that you can work on the tech side, you can work on the policy side, but unless you also work on the information consumption side, on the citizen resilience side, I don't think there is any way to ever get ahead of the curve. So I'd commend their book to you, and I think it's very nice framing for what I'm going to talk about today. So why do we care about this, the weaponization of social media, the spread of disinformation? We can't have an election anywhere in the world, including the United States, without a flood of disinformation. It is fundamentally threatening our ability to have free and fair elections globally, including in the most established democracies. We see efforts to completely undermine governments. And I'll give the example of Ukraine. We see deliberate efforts and undeliberate efforts. So there's misinformation, which is kind of undirected, and disinformation, which is directed and purposeful, and very much have the intention of sowing polarization and social discord with that as its sole end. And I think this is the main strategy of the Russians, which is very effective. They don't need to convince Americans to believe anything. They just need to convince us that we're all so divided because of gun control, because of race, because of immigration, because of a lack of trust in our institutions. They just have to convince us that we're so divided and extreme that we all just turn on each other, and then they don't really have to do anything. We do their job for them. There's the wide dissemination of hate speech and conspiracy theories. So whether it's about the Rohingya in Myanmar, whether it is about immigrants on the border, weaponization of social media is one of the really serious threats. We see increasingly a tendency to discredit dissidents, political opposition, and social movements. That's nothing new, but it's becoming more sophisticated, more used by governments. And I'll give two examples. The Sudanese protest movements. The Sudanese government was actively using disinformation on social media to sow distrust in the movement leaders. And then also in Hong Kong, the Chinese government has been using a very coordinated campaign against the young people who are leading that movement. And again, all they have to do is make people not trust them, not join them, distrust their motives, and then the movement weakens even without them having to to intervene more forcefully. A lot, as I'm sure a group at CSAC knows, a lot of recruitment for terrorist group is done online. The last count I saw about ISIS handles on Twitter was over 15,000, but I'm sure that's higher now. And then misinformation, disinformation campaigns also threaten public health and other public policy concerns. So we can look at coronavirus, we can look at attacks on polio workers, we can look at Ebola virus. There's all the anti-vax campaign against measles, where social media is used to spread disinformation about public health issues. And then you can just name an issue and you will find people concerned about disinformation. I was just out of the Gates Foundation. They're incredibly worried about disinformation. They've been making roughly, this is a technical word for all of you at CSAC, a gajillion-dollar investment in vaccines. And here we see a bunch of people on social media can completely undermine public trust and willingness to give their children those vaccines. They're also investing a lot of money in, say, genetically modified crops and pest-resistant crops. Well, if disinformation is rampant and people won't use it, guess what happens to that investment, even if it's based on the best science and would actually solve lots of food crises? It doesn't matter, because it's even if the information's not true. So I'm going to try and move a little bit more quickly, but I just wanted to share this one example. It really was striking to me that according to this one study cited here, 56% of the most shared political images in the lead up to the 2018 Brazilian elections were misleading, according to this one study. And I just wanted to put this up here to show you how truly global this problem is and how severe the problem is. And of course, the threat landscape is growing. More and more people are getting online. More and more people are using social media. And these are just a couple of statistics about Twitter and Facebook. But of course, there's also WhatsApp and TikTok and all kinds of others. And a lot of people also get their news globally from social media rather than traditional media outlets. And here's just some recent Pew data on where Americans get their news. 52% of Americans get their news on Facebook. Hope God has mercy on their souls for that, but something else. And then trust in traditional media is also quite low. So this is brand new Edelman Public Trust Barometer data. Less than half of the population in the 27 global markets that were surveyed trust the media. And 82% of Americans expect to read misleading information online about the 2020 elections. And also, by the way, they also are expecting to see foreign countries spread. So 57% are saying the media they use are contaminated with untrustworthy information. And 76% are saying, I worry about information or fake news being used as a weapon. Specifically, that was the word in the survey that Edelman Public Trust Barometer used. And 76% said yes. So the threat is escalating. I really want to commend this new Oxford University report to you that came out. According to it, organized social media manipulation campaigns have taken place in 70 countries. That's up from 48 countries in 2018 and 28 countries in 2017. And there is one reason for this, in my view. It's effective. It works. And it's very low cost. And you can hire people to do this for you. You don't even need a super sophisticated homegrown operation. There's wider usage by non-state actors. And Twitter has removed 1.2 million terrorist-linked accounts in 2015, one data point. And then during the US 2016 election, Twitter reports that Russian-generated propaganda was downloaded by users delivered to users 454.7 million times, and Facebook internal analyses estimated that 126 million users saw Russian information on its platforms just during the 2016 election campaign, just in the US. So again, I think we really start to see the scope and scale of the threat. The technology is accelerating. I won't go into this too much, but there's the ability to produce false and misleading images. It's just getting easier and easier. Adobe has a new tool that was just released in the last couple of months that makes it super easy for anyone, even perhaps a neophyte like me, to manipulate an existing video to make it look like someone is saying words that are put into their mouths. Deepfakes, which are so sophisticated that it becomes really hard to recognize what is true and what is not true. Bots and sock puppets, where the identity, where either fake, where computers are spreading the news, or there are sort of fake personas created. Those are getting more and more sophisticated with the further development of artificial intelligence. And then another dimension of this is that more and more we're seeing these used not just on public platforms, but also in private chat rooms on Facebook and in other encrypted sites, which make it harder and harder for the platforms to intervene. So another concerning element of this already concerning trend is that the weaponization of social media is becoming a real policy tool of choice by authoritarian states. And there's a pretty long list of authoritarian states that are gravitating towards the tool. I'll zero in on two. In Russia, just to give one example, a study of 28 Russian government-controlled Instagram accounts registered 145 million projected total interactions. So again, that shows the scale and sophistication of the Russian effort. And it's not just in the United States, by the way. I mean, they are using this tool globally and influencing local elections in Africa and elsewhere. In China, the 50 Cent Army is generating around 448 million online comments every year. So this is just a flood of things that look to people like you and me, like legitimate individuals, maybe who look like they belong to our social networks, even if they don't, who can actually spread a lot of information that some of us will come to believe. There's been a 150% increase in the countries using organized social media manipulation campaigns over the last 2 years, according to that Oxford study. So I just want to call your attention to that too. So I'm going to zoom through this because I think a group like this is aware of how online misinformation, disinformation works. One is our brains are wired to think that things that are familiar to us and we see repeatedly are more likely to be true. It's just how our brains happen to function. And so when you overwhelm social media with the same message again and again, you almost can't help yourself but to start to believe something or can't remember if it's true or not. Another issue is confirmation bias. If For instance, the Russians are targeting groups that are already suspicious of immigrants and have used all kinds of anti-immigrant messaging, which look like they're coming from their own social networks. It reinforces a bias that may already be there. And this is how all of our brains work. We have confirmation bias to further believe things that we already believe and fit new information into our existing intellectual frameworks. And so it plays on that. It also plays on the fact that humans are social creatures. We are part of social creatures. We trust the people around us. It goes back to when we all had to organize to take down the mammoths or whatever, protect ourselves from other groups back in eons ago. And so it plays on our ability to trust information that's coming from our own social networks more than others. It just plays on how our brains generally work, and also our sense of identity by playing up the groups that we belong to. And I want to also, and also this issue I didn't mention with cognitive science, is it's really, social media tends to play on our ability. We have a natural tendency, our brains want to share threatening information more than non-threatening information. Again, there are some really good evolutionary reasons for us to want to do that. And so when we have an emotional response to something, our brains are already primed. It lights up certain parts of our brains that are the same kinds of things that light up in response to a threat. And we are more likely to share things when that part of our brain is engaged. So a 2016 study, which is cited here, shows that 59% of links posted on social media have never actually been clicked on by the people who post them. So it's just this immediate reaction. You get an emotional response, you press the forward, maybe with an outraged comment or whatever, but most people don't even take the time to open. It's just triggering that threat response.
So they respond to a title?
Yes, they respond to a title or headline, a photo, or something like that. And so when I get to media literacy, to foreshadow a little bit, one of the things you need to do is not just rely on fact-checking behavior. You have to deal with the fact that people are having an emotional response. And fact-checking, frankly, it doesn't work very well because it doesn't deal with that emotional component. So I'll get to what we can do about that. So how should societies respond? As I said earlier, I think there are three major options. One is government regulation, and I do think we're heading towards more government regulation. California, by the way, is probably going to be earlier, European on the earlier side. Tech platform response. I think we're already starting to see at least some movement, but not nearly enough. Also tech solutions, so using artificial intelligence, shifting the way the algorithms are processing and so on. There's a lot happening in the tech world. But as I also said at the beginning, we need a third component, which is we have to be able to work on the citizen side as well. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One is government regulation will always lag behind the threat. Government is not good in democracies at making laws and regulations that keep up with fast-changing technological innovations. And there is always an incentive for actors to get ahead of the regulation. On the tech side, and also there's the issue that if you talk to human rights experts, anything that involves government censoring information will legitimately produce some concerns. And we're already seeing a lot of authoritarian countries around the world using the veil of fake news as a justification in order to censor opposition movements, dissidents, and so on. So it's a really tricky balance. And Mark Zuckerberg has received a lot of criticism for saying he doesn't want to be the arbiter of truth. And maybe they could be arbiters of truth a little bit more. But even so, there is a point there about who do we want to be the arbiters? And government, by the way, isn't always a great arbiter of who we want to be deciding what's true and what's not, and who can speak and who can't, because of this issue of political motivation. Not that we ever have it in our own system, that political motivation might take over key decisions. Tech platform response, again, it's really hard for the technology not to either lag behind developments or keep out things that should belong in the public sphere in terms of free speech. And then there's just this issue that unless citizens do a better job of processing the disinformation, the bad guys, the people with motivations, can always be a step ahead in a free society. And so I think all three of these things, none of them are silver bullets. but you have to work with all three legs of the stool. And right now, I would argue that the third is where there is the least activity, the least attention, the least research, the least investment. And that's why I wanted to come to CSAC and see if you all can help us change this. So here are just a couple of quotes from Peter Singer and Nina Jankowicz, who studied this information, this issue, and they're really advocating, they and others, for more of a citizen level response to supplement the other two approaches. So let me talk to you about what my organization, but also many others, are doing on to try and build that citizen resilience to disinformation. And I want to start by telling you that, one, I'm very proud of the work my organization is doing, but I also want to tell you it is so wildly inadequate. It is not even a drop in a bucket. It is a drop in a drop in a bucket. And so we need to really see some solutions scale much faster, and they need to be global to address the issues I raised earlier. So there are some examples of where this is working. Sweden, Finland, and Estonia, and I'd say the Finns are probably the furthest ahead, actually have national campaigns to address citizens' resilience to disinformation. They have curriculum in schools, they have public information campaigns, they work with adults. They obviously live in smaller, more homogeneous countries. There's an immediate threat of Russian propaganda right there. The Swedes, I was just told by the Swedish ambassador, are actually recreating a government agency they had in during World War II called, that's to fight information warfare, basically. But they really see that education and public education are part of the solution. So they are trying to do it on a systemic level, and I think Ukraine is rapidly creeping up behind them, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. So this is where IREX is working. As Colin said, I run an organization called IREX. We're a 50-year-old global education and development NGO. We work in more than 100 countries. And one of the things that we started to work on very organically a few years ago in Ukraine is media literacy. Our team started to work on it because we were working on helping citizens to prepare for democratic reform, democratic elections. We've worked in Ukraine for decades. Our team is Ukrainian. They know the country very, very well. We're deep in the communities there. And what they were hearing is this tremendous problem in the population saying, we don't even know what to believe anymore. We're just overwhelmed with this Russian propaganda. What do we do? So they started working through the public library system on a curriculum we call Learn to Discern. And since then, it has grown and grown. And now we are working directly with the Ministry of Education in Ukraine. We are working in more than 650 secondary schools. The curriculum is not a standalone media literacy curriculum. It's actually woven across the curriculum. So when I was in Ukraine in October, I saw a social studies class that was analyzing Soviet-era cartoons. And you know, they were asked to use critical thinking skills. It's in their art curriculum. It's in their science curriculum. It is woven across the whole thing. So it's not an add-in, it's woven in. And I met with the Ministry of Education. She's really committed to this. It's going into pre-service teacher education. It is going into mandatory teacher professional development. They're taking it very, very seriously because they believe it is a threat. We are seeing good results so far, but we're working really hard to iterate and improve this. So an evaluation of students in 50 schools, so this was before we scaled to 650, students, after they had a couple weeks of a curriculum, were twice as likely to detect hate speech, 18% better at identifying fake news stories, and I believe they're also 28% better at identifying locus of control, which is basically, especially in certain parts of the world, who owns the media outlets has a tremendous impact on what they happen to report and not report. So showing awareness of who owns those sites is a very important component of media literacy training. In Serbia, for instance, where we also run this curriculum, that's a very important issue. And the effects are lasting. So when we did the program with adults in Ukraine, even a fairly short intervention, and when we did a controlled study before and after and doing an independent test of skills rather than self-reporting, even a year and a half later, we saw adult learners were 28% more likely to demonstrate sophisticated knowledge of the news media industry, 13% identifying a fake news story, and about 25% better at fact-checking to actually cross-check and see if what they were seeing is true. So it does have, it's not very expensive, and according to our research, where there's a whole impact study on our website if you want to look at it. It apparently does have lasting effects in terms of changing behavior. So if you do take the time to do a media literacy curriculum, you will see some results. We actually have a pilot going on through coffee shops in Ukraine right now where people can download some little mini courses and get free cups of coffee if they take the online courses. We've had 10%, we had 10,000 people take it in 1 month. So just random people off the street deciding to take it. We had a 25% completion rate. Each of them are 3 to 5 minutes, and there's, I think, 6 components. We have a 25% completion rate of those 10,000 people. And for those of you who know Coursera and other MOOCs, 25% is actually a really high percentage. And the reason I think that's interesting is, of course, we have a self-selected group. They decided to download this app and take the course. But still, it shows the demand that is there in a population like Ukraine right now.
Are they on your website?
That's not on our website because it's a pilot, but we try and put it, once the data is like really clean and vetted, we do try and put it on our website. So for instance, let me just point to this Jordan data to you. This is data from the last few months. So we work with youth in Jordan. We also work through mothers groups. And of course, there we're talking more about propaganda and fake news, disinformation that's spread more by extremist groups. And their participants relative to a control group demonstrated a 44% better ability to identify and analyze false or manipulative information, 14% greater sense of control over how they respond to the information they consume. That gets to the emotional response, because we want to work on that too. And 78% more knowledgeable about the news media industry. And again, that gets to that, who is producing the information that I am consuming? And is that a critical source? What is the agenda of that group or person or organization? So there are challenges. One is reaching different demographic groups. So American Facebook users 65 and older are 7 times more likely to share fake news than their younger counterparts. That is a finding that holds up, maybe not those exact ratios, but that finding holds up in other countries as well, that older people are more likely than younger people. Like my son grew up like attached to his cell phone. They are more skeptical about what they consume and forward than their grandparents are. But we have to reach those different demographic groups. So frankly, the work we're doing in schools and through mothers groups and everything is great, but if you only work with young people don't vote at the same level. And how long is it going to take for enough young people to have had this training that they have systems level effects? So you have to work with older audiences too. So we have a little experiment right now. We were hired by Great Courses. I don't know if you know them. They used to do like video tapes and training. They now have online training. It's mostly has an older American population. Their market research shows that people will pay for this. And so they hired IREX to do a course. And we're going to get all the data from this. We'll see who takes it, whether they finish it, and so on. But we need to work through public libraries or another technique we've used. We just ran a public service campaign nationally in Georgia. We've done the same in Ukraine. We have to try and figure out ways to reach all these different groups, because if you work at the school system, that's a long-term systemic response, but it doesn't get at the different audiences. Reaching scale, another huge issue. How do you actually reach enough people to make a difference? If you inoculate 10% of a population against measles, that's not enough. You have to reach a certain threshold rate where you have herd protection. And we don't know, this is one of my research questions for all of you, we don't know at what level media literacy and information literacy is enough, or even at what behaviors are enough. If people just stop sharing disinformation, we'd already be ahead. Like, you can believe whatever crazy things you want to believe, but for goodness sakes, please don't share it. Just like, when I sneeze, I don't sneeze into my hand and shake someone's hand. I sneeze now into my elbow because I've been taught to do it, so I don't pass on the germs. If I want to read a crazy clickbait story, fine, but maybe I don't forward it to my 60 closest friends that they share with their 60 closest friends. So how do you do that? Staying current but apolitical. This is a problem. Elites use and manipulate disinformation. We cannot cast this as something that ill-informed, ill-educated people do. There's not very flattering study of Stanford students, by the way. I thought it would be impolite to bring it up, but how much they believed in some fake news stories. But also, elites manipulate and use it. There's been some interesting reporting about the Boris Johnson election and the systematic use of disinformation by the Tory campaign. There's been some reporting in other countries as well. And so trying to deal with the issue without it looking like it's directed at one group or the other and making it political, it's actually very challenging. We try and stay on the right side of the line on this, but it's actually, it is a challenge. And staying agile, because the threats are changing all the time. I'm going to wrap quickly. This is my last slide. So the potential is there, I think. To be successful, we need a holistic strategy that involves regulation, technology responses, and citizen resilience. We need high-level commitment and sustained response. It's great that NATO is talking about this, but where is the actual sustained allied commitment? It's great that we see a few governments really taking this seriously, Sweden, Finland, but what about all the other countries in the world, including ours? Global and national coordination. It's not possible to do this alone, actually. There has to be global coordination. Long-term solutions like education in schools are key, but they really have to be coupled with much more targeted interventions. I mean, I think there has to be a ramp up of responses around every election in the world going forward, honestly. And other high disinformation events, disease outbreaks would be another one, coronavirus, there's a lot of disinformation around it and so on. And there's a tremendous need for better research and data. We know so little about what interventions work, what is more successful, what has the most durable impact, what are better solutions with different demographic groups, different contexts. It is also a very different thing, for instance, to talk about societal-wide information inoculation compared to what happens if I am one of those Hong Kong protesters who's being targeted with disinformation. What do I do as an individual activist? There's just so much we don't know. And so one of the reasons I wanted to come here today is to really hope that you and many other research organizations will continue doing great work on the algorithms and the tech platforms and all the exciting possibilities that entails, continue to work on the regulation side and the impact there, but also to add this to the research agenda too. So with that, I will stop. I will answer questions if I can, but mostly I'd like to hear from you about what we're going to do about this.
Great. Thanks, Kristen. So we're actually going to start with Herb Lin here. For those of you who don't know, Herb is one of our co-leads for the Stanford Information Warfare Working Group, which is a multidisciplinary group of Stanford researchers and professors who are looking at the causes and consequences of disinformation, most especially technology-enabled disinformation campaigns. So again, I think Kristen is looking for questions, but also feedback and recommendations and insights from research that you may be aware of or engaged in. So Herb, first to you.
Okay, if you could go back to the
Here,
the previous slide about the challenges.
Yep, I'll
By
do
the way,
that.
this is a great talk.
Yeah.
And thank you for.
Thanks, Herb.
Which brings up all kinds of interesting questions. This chart here suggests is missing one very important thing.
Oh, good, because I'm giving this talk again.
You're one bullet away from a solution.
Okay, which is that all of what you've talked about is giving people the ability to be more discerning, to be better critical thinkers, and so on. None of what you've said has anything to do with increasing the propensity to engage in exercising those abilities. And I have to point out, those are very different things. Most people who are, most people who are capable of doing both critical thinking and uncritical thinking. And the question is not that some people do critical thinking and other people don't. It's that some people do critical thinking in circumstance X, but not in Y.
Yeah.
Okay. And the thing that I'm concerned about in your evaluations is that when you evaluate somebody, you're automatically cueing them to invoke critical thinking. Can you do this? Can you discern what fake news is? I'm not concerned about their ability to do that in an exam or in an evaluation. I'm concerned about their ability to do it as they're wandering around on the street, okay, when they're not aware that they're being evaluated. And getting a handle on that part of it, increasing the propensity for doing critical thinking when it's necessary, is a much, much more difficult task. I agree that what you're doing is a necessary component, but I'd say what you're talking about here is basically engaging a literature that's been built up about critical thinking, teaching critical thinking skills for 50 years. And it's very important literature. I've even done some of that stuff myself, but one of the reasons I got out of that was that I found it was too hard to actually get people to do it spontaneously.
Yeah.
And so I was wondering if you could comment on that part
Yeah.
of it.
No, it's a great question. And by the way, I have always loved working with Herb Lynn. We worked on a huge CNAS cybersecurity study together once in a day. And his chapter is still on the website of CNAS, and it's worth going back and looking at. It's a great point, Herb. We try to deal with it. The one thing we do try to do in the curriculum is deal with this emotional manipulation part. And we do find results when people become aware to recognize the signs of their own emotional response, their own emotional recognition, that in later times they report that they changed their behavior. Now, I think you're right, though, by studying the behavior, you are priming people to be thinking the way that you want. So what I think would be outstanding, that is if a leading research institution like Stanford would actually really take questions like that seriously and do some experiments so that we know it worked. And since I joined IREX, I have had a beautiful dream that has completely failed and not turned into reality. And that is, as someone who has spent my career moving from a university to think tanks to a think and do organization like USIP to an almost all do organization like IREX, by the way, and I was in government as well, I have been looking for there to be a closer link between the think and the do. So if you, Herb, were to tell me, I really want to study that issue, I would say, great, don't just go out and write a paper though. What I'd like you to do is work with an organization like IREX or one of the other NGOs out there, and I want you to go out and actually test whether people will actually change their behavior based on different types of interventions and A/B tests. And then I want you to come back and I want you to write a second paper on what you learned. And then maybe in an ideal world, you would iterate it again and you would share it. That kind of iteration between, and I think I even bored Colin with a longer version of this soapbox routine at one point, like that is actually the kind of research we need in order to find true solutions. We need to take legitimate insights like the one Herb raised. We need to find out what the research tells us about what would help, and then we need to test actual honest-to-goodness interventions and feed that research back. So that's my plea to you.
So I've got a couple of two fingers. Lindsay, I think you, and make sure everybody introduce yourself. I introduced Herb for him because I didn't trust him to introduce himself. I had to cue him to the right thing. But please introduce yourself to Kristen and to the rest of us. Go ahead.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm Lindsay Kroll. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at CSAC. I'm from the U.S. and I actually did my PhD in Sweden. And there were some differences I noticed in their whole educational system. It seemed like there was like a bigger emphasis on critical thinking and like learning to sort of be a good citizen, like contribute to society. Whereas in the U.S., it's maybe more exam focused, learn for the test. Do you find any like cultural differences, or like perhaps related to the educational system and how responsive people are in like being able to be trained to discern like good information from bad information?
Yeah, that's a really good question. There are a couple of points I want to raise. One is it is much easier to work in countries like Sweden or Ukraine where there is a centralized education ministry. It is much, much easier. So if you want to make a change like this, you are working with government and they are education ministries, so it may take forever, but eventually you actually can change the entire system at once. That is not possible in a country like the US, where we have 50 different state education decision-making bodies, where it's a highly decentralized structure. So that is one thing that countries like Sweden have going for them. The other thing is, as you mentioned, and it didn't used to be this way in the US though. This is a whole other field of research and a phenomenon in the US. civics education in the US has been declining and declining for years and decades. So actually, people of the age that, well, I'm older than Colin, but even, we actually took civics when we were in school once upon a time. People don't take civics in school the same way that they once did. Now, there are some people, there is a movement in this country trying to change that. It is a changeable thing if people want to do it, because it wasn't always that way. But yeah, that obviously really helps. And it's an obvious place in the curriculum where you would integrate these kinds of skills. I do think that one thing we have going for us is critical thinking is something that 21st century workers need, and IREX works with young people in school systems all over the world, and that is what is in demand by employers, people who can problem solve, and as machines with automation and machines taking on more roles, that's what you need from the humans. So there are reasons to get this into the curriculum that can be made that are politically safe, but it will also have some bigger benefits.
Kelly, did you have a two-finger? Did you have two-finger? Yeah, and introduce yourself to everybody else.
I'm Kelly Bourne. I'm the director of the Cyber Policy Center. Kristen, it's great to see you.
Great to see you, Kelly. Thanks for coming.
It's so fun to see this. I came over from the Hewlett Foundation recently, and we actually funded the studies at Facebook and Northeast.
Oh, that I thought you were going to say the IREX, but I was like, well, not IREX, but no hard feelings. So.
Those studies, so it's really fun to see.
Yeah, and thank you, because Hewlett Foundation is one of the only organizations that is funding research on this issue. So I really do want to call out Hewlett for that, because we need so much more. And what little we have, a lot of it came from Hewlett Foundation.
Yeah, thank you. And I started that program there before I left and came here. So I couldn't echo more your call for we need research that we can then translate into effective policies. I had two quick thoughts on resources related to that might be of interest to you and others in the room. Funded one project with the Social Science Research Council to start collecting all of the research that we and others were funding that was policy relevant. And that website, I think it's listed under MediaWell. I'd have to double check, but that is now up and running. And likewise, did a similar project with Rand that was looking at what are nonprofits doing to address disinformation and some of the evidence behind that. I had two quick questions for you, because I have gone somewhat on the record as being really skeptical of citizen-facing interventions and would love to be corrected on that, because I would love to have that hope. And so my questions are two or threefold, and sort of relate a little bit to what you were saying. So I'll start there with, are there different geopolitical contexts in which we are more confident that these kinds of interventions would work? When you have more, smaller, more homogeneous, less polarized societies, or, in the case of Ukraine, when you have an outside threat that people are sort of aware of and rallying against, versus the U.S. context where you have such heavy partisan infighting. The other question I had for opt-in solutions like this is, do you just end up preaching to the choir? Like, I think everyone in this room would opt in to take a course like that, but I would argue might not be the primary problem here. And so, and then I guess the last thing I'd say is I've been skeptical of citizen-facing interventions, at least in contexts like the U.S., because we can't even get half of Americans to vote in a presidential election. So the idea that, given how busy we are, I mean, if anyone, we should all be the ones taking the time to look into who is the funding source behind the source that, and so I'm just concerned that if we suggest that the solution can be citizens, are we helping reduce the pressure on governments and platforms to solve the problem in a way that might end up suggesting citizens can do it when that might not be as realistic. So I'm curious how you think.
Yeah, thanks. Those are all really good questions. First of all, I think we can't reduce the pressure on platforms and government. I tried to be crystal clear, and I would want to echo this again, that I think that we have to have government regulation. We have to have technology platform reform and also technological solutions to address it. I just also don't see how you can be successful unless you work on the citizen side for all the reasons I laid out. Whether I think there are reasons to question how we get to scale on the citizen side that are unanswered. I think they are answerable, and it is possible. The cost is actually quite low. We do see sustained behavior change at very low cost intervention. So the data I showed you from Ukraine, I think we figured that was like I'd have to double check, but I think it cost 40 cents a person. because of the model that worked through public law. So, I mean, in terms of ROI, now an unanswered question is the one that I raised before, which is how many people have to change their behavior for it to make a difference. So, you know, I think we do need a lot more research. So in terms of the different contexts, I think it is always easier to get people to change their behavior when there is an outside threat and it is a big outside threat, or any threat. That's just human nature. And so the more it is not a coincidence that Finland, Estonia, Sweden, and Ukraine are the countries that have gotten their act together the best. I would argue that maybe the time is coming in the US where, you know, you could actually mobilize more of a response. I don't know, you know, I think we'll see. But if the threat continues to escalate the way I laid out, maybe if the threat diminishes or slips into the background, or, you know, we have a coronavirus plague and everybody's focused on that, it will be hard to do anything. But if the threat continues to grow, I'm not a hyperbolic person. It's not really my thing. I'm from New England. But I really do think that you do start to talk about fraying the very foundations of democracy when citizens don't know what to believe. And I think one of the biggest threats is not that, you know, we talk about polarization all the time. I think disengagement, complete civic disengagement, is actually the path that this is more likely to lead to, especially in a country like the United States. Yes, polarization is there, but you could just see people turn off. And, you know, I was talking to Colin about how I'm going to Egypt. I'm on the board of trustees for the American University there in Cairo. And one of the things that I observe in Egypt is just that people do not, before Tahrir Square in particular, people just didn't engage in the public square. Your engagement is with your family, with your neighbors, and you just turn inward because you just don't think you can make a difference or want to engage. That, I think, is the risk for democracy. I don't know how you run a democracy when people just start distrusting so much that they decide they're going to go, forget it. I think that's one reason why people don't vote. One is they don't think it really matters because everything seems okay. But another one is they don't really trust any of the institutions involved. And so I think that I understand your skepticism in citizen-facing approaches, and, you know, we can't even get more than half of Americans to vote. I think we did see in the midterms that when citizens are, you know, when there's a citizens perceive a threat, they will mobilize. But also, I think we're seeing growing distrust in institutions. And I think if you don't have this kind of education, that's likely to grow. And I do think the consequences are pretty severe. The last thing I want to say on this, I did have something else I wanted to say on this that might be escaping me now. On the citizen approaches is that, well, that wasn't enough talking to get it back, whatever I was going to say, but it couldn't have been that, important. But I think that, I know what I was going to say. In terms of, I do think targeting different groups, there is some, we're working now in 13 countries. We are getting more and more data back. So even in 3 weeks, I'll have even more data to share with you. I was kind of hoping I'd have some new data today. But we actually are seeing that there is a demand for this, that people will go. We just did a pilot in Arizona and New Jersey, and people showed up. You know, why would people show up for free? Not just to take a training, but to volunteer to train other people. It's a salient issue for people. So these are kind of preliminary, and there is some self-selection going on here. But, you know, great courses, it's a private company. They actually thought Americans would pay for this. So I think we have to just get out there more and find out. But these are all answerable questions, even if they have not been answered. And I would like to see more research telling us where to place our efforts. Yeah.
So this side of the table, I have Rosanna and then the woman right next to you. So go ahead, Rosanna.
Hi, my name is Rosanna Guadagno. I work with Herb and direct the Information Warfare Working Group. And my expertise is as a social psychologist, so I study at an individual level what's typical for human social behavior. And my expertise is technology use and social influence and persuasion. So
Perfect.
I would love to have a long conversation with you because everything I want to say, there's not enough time. But Kelly, I respectfully disagree with you. I think that the person-centered focus can work, especially if it's coordinated with kind of some of these higher level technological and legislative changes. It needs to be attacked at all of the different angles. And you're absolutely right. There is so little research that's actually looked thoroughly at what the different interventions could do to help people develop resistance to disinformation. And not only that, the few studies that are out there haven't really looked at combining. So like I've seen some studies
Yeah.
that say media literacy works, which I think is great. There are other studies that say that if you convey norm change, that can help too. Motivating people to be accurate, which is a little bit on the nose with media literacy. And then there's mixed evidence on fact checking, whether or not it works. Sometimes
Right.
fact checking works, sometimes it doesn't. And I think it has a lot to do with the language you use to convey what's the information in the fact checking, because linguistics is huge.
And to Herb's point, I think it also depends on context.
Context, yes. Context, and I also think, and I'm surprised we've never had this conversation here, but when you were talking about the need to shift people into the deeper thinking, the thing that occurred to me while you two were talking is I'd love to see an intervention, or maybe we could develop one, where we try to get kind of these deeper, more thoughtful manners of thinking, so system two thinking or central processing in my language, to be more of a habit. Because the way to get people to really change their behavior long term is to use repetition and certain types of reinforcement to make a mode of thinking or whatever it is you're trying to get somebody to adopt a habit.
Yep.
Once it becomes a habit, they no longer think about it. And so we can figure out a way to try to get people to habitually think about what it is they're sharing before they share it. That could help. I mean, obviously, again, there are things that the tech industry should do, and I'd like to see our government do, but I think there are things we can do to help people stop feeling so overwhelmed by what was already an overwhelming technological system before all the disinformation came.
Can I tell you that that's exactly where the coffee shop idea came from?
Mm-hmm.
You know, our team is sort of reading up on cognitive science and how our brains work, and it's this issue of making a habit. So when do people sit and scroll their phones? While they're sitting drinking their coffee. So the idea was if you get people to be thoughtful about how they're consuming information while they're having the coffee and sitting with their phones, that it would actually be a habit and trigger. And that's why there are multiple little tiny segments, not just so people would do it, but then it builds a habit. And it's a test. It's a test, so we're going to get the data back. But that's, I mean, that's one example. It may not work, but I think it's the kind of test we need to be running as to what gets people to do this. The other thing is what you called, give people a sense of control. We know people feel overwhelmed. And so this is one of the findings from our Jordan work, is that young people feel like, there's a little video on our website where you can see the young people speaking for themselves. They feel more sense of control and agency around their consumption of information. So they don't feel like a victim in a storm. They feel like, I can assert some control. I can make some choices. Now, one of the really interesting unanswered research questions is, we have anecdotal information, especially from our Serbian team, that after you give people this training, they will demand more quality information, that they will pay for quality news. But I told our team, that's anecdotal reporting. That's not an empirical finding. I would love to see whether this kind of training actually increases demand for quality information. And I would love to see, you know, all the funders and philanthropists that want to support quality independent media also looking to fund whether, if you give people this training, do they actually want it more? We know they change their behaviors in terms of fact checking and multiple sources, but will they actually pay and work for better news?
That's a really interesting question. And the other thing I was wondering, kind of consistent with that, is if you get people to think more, or be more thoughtful as they're evaluating information on the internet, it would be really cool to do a study where you actually track their phone history over time. And some people will consent to do this as part of the study. And it'd be really interesting to see if over time, as they're, say, downloading the little droplets and doing the classes while drinking their coffee, if over time their internet searches change, the websites they look at change, basically shifting more towards more factual, credible information.
And you actually have someone you should talk to, Karen Edwards, who runs SOAP, does this in the US, and it's a mobile app that young people use. I wonder if you could talk to her about whether the data could become available to track whether young people's information consumption behavior changes after they have some of this. So it's, I mean, I think there are platforms you could use to test this.
Well, that would be really cool. I'd love to get connected with them.
I will.
I'm sure there are tech companies in town that would give you the data with or without people's permission.
Why not us? You give it to everybody else.
Right.
You don't offer a good return on investment.
Maybe I need to fix an ad.
Chris, this is phenomenal. This is, I get really energized about it. So my name is Vera Zakhan. I am a tech and policy advisor with a nonprofit that connects Silicon Valley and DC.
Nice to meet you, by the way. Yeah.
partnered with IREX before. Basically, I work a lot on tech and policy, but before that, I was running a strategy and ops at Twitter. And prior to that, I evaluated a lot of influence operation, information operations, disinformation programs, both from security and from citizen resiliency in a lot of the European markets and a lot of the countries that you focused on. So here's my question to you. I mean, I couldn't agree with you more, because I think in countering this, it's a really like a three-pronged stool and approach. Yes, there's governments, there's tech companies, and what we can do from the cyber and from the security side. But I 100% agree with you. You cannot do this without citizen resiliency. And citizen resiliency is not just media literacy, but also working because there's a monopolization issue of media. And when you think about the billion people in developing countries that are going to come online, right? And what's happening also with actual internet infrastructure. So my question is this. There's two pieces to this. One is beyond media literacy and critical thinking, what can also, when you think about the citizens' resiliency, particularly not just in the US, but in developing countries where we're seeing a lot of disinformation all over the world, how do we also ensure that we create the infrastructure to combat disinformation from whether it's internet, so we're also addressing not monopolizing, working to not monopolizing media in these markets. And then the second kind of unrelated question, you talked about demographics, how it's much easier to get, for example, young people, right, to use, to really test them on their media literacy skills and so forth. But what about other disenfranchised populations and target groups, whether it's women, whether it's LGBTQ, different disenfranchised populations where arguably there has been research done that there are perhaps even more victims of disinformation, particularly not just here in the United States. We can also, of course, be talking about the US elections, but in other parts of the world where this is happening as well. And I know IREX does a lot of wonderful work and a lot of wonderful programs around some of those topics as well. So I'm curious if you could also comment on that.
Yeah, thanks. And I love the question about infrastructure. And I want to point you toward Laura Rosenberger has an article coming out in Foreign Affairs, and I think it's going to be the June issue. I haven't seen it yet, but she's told me a lot about it. And she's going to talk about this issue of infrastructure. And I'm really glad you raised it because I'll talk for a minute about the quote unquote infrastructure I think we need in democratic societies. But one of the things Laura is working on a number of papers about is the Chinese disinformation strategy is completely different from, say, the Russian strategy. And it is much more what I would term a denial strategy. You don't actually have to deal with some of the issues that we're talking about because you just simply wall off the ability of your citizens to get access to this other stuff. If you literally don't ever get outside your walled garden and they can control the garden, you don't actually have to worry about changing the minds of people because they can't even be, other messages can't even penetrate. So that's something I think to look for more research on and more writing on. I think she's right about that. In terms of the infrastructure that needs to be there in a free society, I think it's what we have traditionally considered to be, those pillars of democratic society, an independent and vibrant civil society, an independent and vibrant free press. And I think with the issue of media ownership comes up a lot. You're very familiar with IREX, Vera, so you may know we've run for years something called the Media Sustainability Index, which is a tool to assess the health of information environments. Frankly, we're completely redoing it because it does not account for a lot of these new dimensions and all the different sources that produce news now besides formal media institutions. So we're going to be rolling out something called VIBE, the Vibrant Information Barometer, and it's to measure across countries the vibrancy of an information ecosystem because there are so many factors that play into that have to do with government and regulation, ownership, internet penetration, usage, norms, and that's something we're going to be trying to capture in this new index. It goes way above and beyond the Media Sustainability Index, which really focused on formal independent media. I could go on, but I think I'm going to leave it there. We also really have to look at the tech platforms and government regulation because these are the new public squares. On the issue of disenfranchised populations, yeah, I think they're especially vulnerable. And it's not just that they happen to end up being victims more often is that outside actors or internal actors specifically target them because they are disenfranchised and can be manipulated to serve political ends and different agendas. I think we've even seen it in the United States. Like, gee, why are the Russians spending time focusing on gun control and Black Lives Matter? It's because they're trying to focus on people who feel like they're being sidelined in their own societies and stir that up, stir the pot. That's the strategy. So I think look at working with those populations is a key part of it, but that's also where it's hard to keep the work apolitical. And so I would prefer strategies that look at, you may need to micro-target populations, but the more we can keep it holistic that everyone needs to do it, I think you don't want to look like you're targeting a certain group so that you're actually intervening and making them feel like you're trying to, because it's not teaching them what to think, it's how to think, but it can look like you're targeting a population on what to think if they're overly targeted. And I could get more into that and give you some examples I've seen in other public diplomacy programs, but that would be, I think, the risk with overly targeting. So.
One thing, just that it's up here, I mean, journalists are also citizens. I wonder how much media literacy needs to be conducted to people in the media, and there's a lot of focus here on the big tech platforms, which is important, but a lot of people still can get their news from traditional media, albeit it shows up in their feed or someone passes it over an email or something like that. And I think that the media organizations that we would consider trusted, that have now all been branded the fake news media, but the mainstream trusted media, the New York Times, the Washington Post, et cetera, have enormous challenges with dealing with disinformation, right? And I'll just give you one, and this goes to your linguistics question, right? Is something not proven? Is there no evidence for it? Or is it debunked? Or is it a lie? Those are all different ways of saying a similar thing, right? But the cautious traditional media a lot of times says there's no evidence to substantiate X, when in fact there's a lot of evidence to show that it's a lie, or it's disinformation, or it's debunked. A current example is I know how much every single day the Biden campaign pushes against this notion that it's not that there is no evidence that Joe Biden did things wrong in Ukraine. It's that the idea that he did something wrong in Ukraine has been systematically debunked. It's very different if you read an article that says there's no evidence, because that leaves open the possibility that you'll find evidence. If you read it and say it's a lie or it's debunked, that has a different reaction. So I guess that's a long winding way of like how much of your media literacy and citizen stuff also needs to be aimed at the people who are producing media.
Yeah, it's interesting because, of course, IREX also has a long history of working with journalists around the world. I mean, decades. And it's a very interesting situation because, especially as disinformation becomes more sophisticated, like how do you tell if that video or photo on social media has been altered? So there is a demand. And we do quietly, and because we don't do training in the US for journalists, but we do it globally, and there is quietly a demand for people, by journalists, to say, help me learn to sort fact from fiction, recognize when images or videos have been edited in a way that's unfair. You've seen some of that in the US recently. But one of the reasons why they are shy to talk about that is, one, they're supposed to be the professionals, right? So you're not going to see people say, like, I too am subject to disinformation. They're also under a lot of pressure. I mean, if you don't know if something is fake or not, but you know your competitors and others are going to forward it on social media, do you get in and comment on it and share it too? Or do you wait and do what we would have back in the day done as due diligence? Well, you're like 12 hours behind the news cycle. You might as well have gone home and taken a nap. And so there's a lot of pressure on journalists in this world to have social media presences, to be quick, and that directly fights against this like care. And then there's this whole other word about like the language, and like if my husband's a lawyer, and don't even get him started on like sanctions law and how it gets reported and how what the media says isn't true. And part of it is a lack of knowledge, because some of it can be very, not what you were talking about, that's a different kind of journalistic choice, but some of it can be very fine-grained and have different meanings legally. And so, that it's a real challenge in this environment. I actually don't see that going away anytime soon. I think we just need to quietly be giving journalists the support they need in a way that is private because they want to do the right thing. And we have to recognize that they're not going to want to advertise to everybody that they need it. But it's kind of a losing battle. So.
I want to follow up on that point.
Yeah.
Introduce yourself, please.
Oh, I'm Jim Salzman. I am a MediaX affiliate working on educational technology and basic literacy and former staff. I want to talk about trust in institutions because I think our only defense against the most important demographic group in a representative government is the legislators. And in Germany, they have a program of compulsory royalties and have since the 1950s. Similar to how we pay compulsory royalties for music that is played on the radio or in public spaces or pirated, they pay journalists through a system of compulsory royalties. And unlike here, their investigative journalism has not completely collapsed with the transition of advertising to online like ours has. And the reason I think this is so important is if you were to rank all the disinformation campaigns of the past half century by either body count or total dollars spent, the 2002 stovepiping of intelligence in front of the authorization for the use of force in Iraq is by far the largest the most impactful disinformation campaign. You had Joe Wilson's expose of Nigerian yellow cake resulting in the outing, the burning of his undercover wife's cover, Valerie Plame. And Bill Nelson said 75 senators were told in closed session right before the vote that Iraq had ships with UAVs poised to attack the eastern seaboard within attack range, when all those senators had in their hands a dissenting report from the Air Force saying that Iraq had a half dozen Czech training drones. And if we had more investigative journalism, that would counter I don't think we can have a constitutional amendment anytime soon to forbid the executive branch from lying, and even if we did, they could probably get around it. But I'm just saying that we really need compulsory royalties like we have for music in journalism.
So I'm, as much as it's a wonderful thing to entertain, I'm personally skeptical. Maybe you're not. I mean, I think the tide is moving in the other direction. I mean, let's look at the UK, where basically taxes have paid for the BBC for years and years and years. Boris Johnson really has the BBC in his sights. And I think that is probably going to be the trend in other countries too. So Germany will probably hold on to that system for now because of the nature of the German political culture, but I can have a really hard time imagining that happening in the US, and that goes really far back. I mean, we just got an arcane law change called the Smith-Mundt Act that forbid, you couldn't even see as an American, we pay for Voice of America to go internationally. There are all kinds of convoluted things happening where you couldn't even look on a website to see what we were showing overseas with your own taxpayer dollars because Americans are so paranoid about government-funded media. I mean, these are deep, deep roots in the United States. So I just don't see it changing.
That was a law against the propaganda power of the U.S. government being used against the
No,
U.S.
that's what it was, exactly. So Smith-Mundt was actually designed, but it actually, because of a fear of government-funded news and media, that is the origins of it. There is such a strain against government-funded media that we had Smith-Mundt that wouldn't even let Americans see what VOA is reporting abroad. Like, I can tell you a personal story where I was in the State Department and we had designed a handout to how to protect yourself against the flu, an avian flu in Indonesia, and people were saying, oh, that's so well done, can't we use it in the United States? And everyone almost had a heart attack because it's illegal to take a material. At that time, it was illegal to take a pamphlet that had designed to protect against the flu overseas and bring it in the US because there's such a paranoia and a set of legal constraints against government-funded quote unquote propaganda. So I don't see it happening in the US. But let me give you where I think there is some hope in the system we have now, and that's at this issue for citizen demand for information. We did actually see a flight to quality after the election of Trump, regardless of what in the media, regardless of what you think about the president or anyone's political predilections are. After the election, enough people decided they needed to pay for news that actually some of the biggest news outlets, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post, contributions to NPR, they all actually went up. So I think that when people decide it's important, they will pay for it. The other area for hope is if you look at the Edelman Public Trust Barometer data, local journalists are trusted. Now, there are also some very disturbing trends. If you read the Atlantic article that came out this week about disinformation with fake news at the local level, that is actually manipulating a very real opportunity that right now local journalists are far more trusted than national level media outlets. So, we could have a renaissance in local journalism that people would trust far more.
Can I just say, I don't think Germans considered their news sources that are independent of the government in ways that maybe the BBC is not so much. The UK government, any more than Americans don't think of, top 40 radio acts that are benefiting from compulsory royalties when they're played on the radio as being government funded. They say PBS and NPR, which have less than a percentage of government, they consider those to be tremendously government funded, but nobody's going to say that, the Justin Bieber is.
Yeah, this is probably a longer conversation. I wonder, a system that rewards virality, like Spotify would reward, this is how people like Billie Eilish became famous without being sponsored. I'm not sure a system that financially rewards virality would be good for combating disinformation, in my mind. But in any case, probably a longer conversation. Might be good for media, but not necessarily good for combating disinformation. Might create incentives in the other direction. Lisa, and then come down here.
Hi, I'm Lisa. I'm a master's student in international policy here, focusing on cyber policy. And my capstone project is on the relationship between internet shutdowns and disinformation in Cameroon. Are you working on that?
No, but I think this whole issue of internet shutdowns, you've seen so many places in the world. We have an office in Sri Lanka, and of course that was a very recent example. And I think for people who care about human rights and democracy and violence, I think a little bit of a tougher call when it comes to was that a good idea or not.
Right, totally. So actually, like in some of my conversations with Cameroonian friends who are the disengaged citizens that you were talking about, like not going out on the streets, sort of just trying to wait for the violence to pass in their region, they thought it was actually kind of a good. This was like a couple conversations. This is not a study I did, but some of my friends were like, "Oh, that was a fine thing. It was nice to have people stop spreading these violent images and fake news around." And I guess my question is, have you thought about levers of? We're working with internews on this project, and they're doing a lot of civil society training on how to make people more resilient against internet shutdowns and give them platform for advocacy and also media training, like similar to what you were doing. And I wonder if you've thought at all, and it'd be very complicated to collaborate with governments on these things, but China trains many governments on certain media or internet norms, I guess. And I wondered if you had thought about that as a lever in any way and whether it's even like a feasible option in various countries. And then another question I have is if you had like a magic wand and could work with Facebook or Twitter or WhatsApp and integrate some kind of slight shift to their platform, what would you put in to have that as a lever for changing this trend?
Yeah, on the first point, I'm not as skeptical as you are, whether it would do any good, but I do think you get governments to work. For instance, Internews and IREX are the two biggest US government partners in the world on supporting independent media and public education relating to media and things like that. So, it is being done. We both have very significant US government grants, some of which deal with normative issues, like our work in Serbia right now about the role of independent media and norms about private ownership of media. Those are normative issues. It's a US government funded program. So I'm actually a little bit more optimistic on that. On the second question about if I had a wish list for Twitter and Facebook, what would I do? One is, I think they could do a lot more education on their sites without and have it be available and sort of push it and do that. I also think there's some very innovative things that can happen. So more on the tech side. So let me give you an example. I was just at ASU and they're working with Facebook to design a tool so that when, let's say I forward you a fake news story, and then I find out later that some new information comes up and it's not true, I actually would get an email or a little notification saying, this thing that you you forwarded has been determined to be false. And not only that, but would you kindly share with the same group of people this corrected thing? I think that's sort of an intriguing thing. So they could be doing more to have prominent educational opportunities, little mini videos, and they could make it really fun and engaging on their sites. And then they could also be doing the things like the ASU example and many, many other things, tweaking their algorithms. Those would be the top of my list.
Would the corrective automatically be shared by all the people who passed it along? Or it would
Probably
be
not.
up for the same people to make it viral? Because the evidence is overwhelming that corrections don't go viral.
So here's my hypothesis. No, corrections don't go viral, and you saw the data I gave about how many people even open the things they're sharing the first time. I also think that human nature is, I'm not going to want to tell you, hey, Colin, remember that thing I showed you? Oops, it was completely false. I'm a dummy. What I do think it would do is, am I going to think more before I share something with you the next time, though? Even if I don't send you the, oh, I'm a dummy text. I think that's where it could have a bigger impact, is on, we need people to just stop sharing. Like, I don't sneeze in my hand and shake your hand.
Right.
I should really think twice before I share a garbage news story with you.
Two finger here and then the gentleman here. Go ahead.
But it's not clear to me at all that they think it's garbage. Everybody knows that coughing in somebody else's face is bad. The germs are bad. The fact that I send something out, there are good reasons for sending it out, even if, to rile people up and so on.
True. What you're saying is true, Herb, but I think if you I think this is where the norm change comes in. If people actually, and our team in Ukraine has been experimenting with this and talking with the people who participate in the training, if people start to get a little bit embarrassed by sharing things that were not well documented, were fake, and it starts to be a not cool thing to do so you don't get the dopamine squirt in your brain when you forward that. Instead, you actually go, oh, I had a reaction to that, I should share it. Oh, wait, I'm gonna look dumb. If the norm changes so that you get you feel like you're being socially judged on that, that would be, whether that's possible, I don't know. That would be a fascinating thing for you to study, by the way. Now Kelly has said. That study happened? Will you send it to me?
Yes.
What came out of it?
So Kevin Munger did a good bots study that socially shames folks. And basically he created bots that would go around, and what they found was that if the bot is a woman, it tends to be dismissed more. If the bot is, for all the ladies around the table, that was awesome to see.
Then why do I listen to Alexa? Okay, keep going.
Well, maybe you are, Colin, but most people don't know the weather. But if the person is racially in group, it tended to have it would tend to be more persuasive. While I have the floor, one other comment I wanted to make, which was, there was actually a study that came out today that talked about, because I've been skeptical people are going to do like deep research, but there was one that was just priming people on like, how do you, like, just giving pause when you read an article about like, why might that not be true, which is much lower hanging fruit and I can be more persuaded by. If people aren't on fake news side, this is a great website. I know Herb's on it because I see you all the time on there. But this is a website that the guys who did the 7X study at Northwestern, David Lazar runs, and all of the great articles that are coming out are posted there for discussion amongst folks like Herb and others in the room, and so that could be a great source for you as you research.
And what was it? Can you say it again for everyone?
Fake News Sci is David Lazar's group, and Kristen, when we meet later, I'll introduce you to David if you want it. Kevin Munger. Okay. And
what you mentioned today.
Where is he? At Princeton, right? Oh, and the one today is.
It was sent to the message.
It was sent to Fake News Sci, and it is pausing to consider why a headline is true or false can help reduce the sharing of false news. Harvard HKS.
Okay.
And this is what our curriculum does, actually. It's to get people to take that second, and that's where we start to see that measurable behavior change. And it gets at that issue of emotional manipulation. when people understand how their own brains work, I mean, because that's part of the curriculum too, is look, this is how our brains work. This is why we react the way that we do. You're not a bad person. You're not a dumb person. It's just this is the way we're wired. And so this awareness now empowers you, and it can keep you doing. That's what our curriculum is really all about. And so I really want to look up that study because we found the same thing. And we have more detailed data than what I've shown you, but that's one of the key skills that comes into play. Perfect.
Send to me too while you're at it.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, real quick,
Yep.
would you spell the sci part of the fake news sci?
SCI for science. It's invitation
Not
only.
It's invitation only, and you've got to get two people to.
Science, SCI, and it's invite only.
You have to have dual authentication. Herb
That's
has
right.
multiple accounts, so the
All over that.
This gentleman right here.
Hi, I'm Todd Stewart, a retired Foreign Service officer. Could you tell me what the best source of statistical information is on social media use by different demographic groups?
I don't think I'm the best qualified person to answer that, but you have others who are.
Pew Internet keeps, pewinternet.org, they keep the best stats on that. And they're very.
Pew Internet.
Pew Internet, yeah, the best stats on people's social media use. You can break down by age, demographic, part of the country, part of the world.
For the
social
US.
media
Yeah.
use.
Yeah, they do more in the US, but they have some internationally. And you saw I quoted them actually on my slides. Yeah.
Melissa, and then over here. Go.
Oh, okay, I'm Melissa Carlson. I'm a pre-doctoral fellow at CSAC. A lot of my research is focused on how rumors and misinformation influence refugee decision-making. And so I was on the ground in Greece in 2016 speaking with Syrian and Iraqi refugees about how rumors and misinformation that they had just gathered influenced their decision to apply for asylum versus using smugglers or in kind of doing both in conjunction with each other. And so I was curious if you could speak a little bit more about, you had mentioned government actors and the tech industry as kind of, potentially being biased in certain ways, but I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about biases that aid organizations might face. Specifically, one of the interesting things that we found was hardly any refugee trusted the UN because the UN had was actively restricting information available about the asylum application process because it was a protection issue. And so especially kind of the discussion before about disenfranchised populations, when you have, I guess, aid organizations or other kind of partners that are trying to go in and trying to, operate in the best interests of disenfranchised populations, how do you balance that bias that inevitably exists there?
Yeah, it's a huge issue. And actually, I want to raise another one relevant to your research that I heard recently. So I was just listening to a panel discussion that I was at this small group of CEOs from development organizations, and the heads of Catholic Relief Services and the new head of Save the Children were talking about how disinformation about refugee populations is a major challenge they have to face. And actually, the NGOs are actually getting really serious threats because they are trying to support refugees, asylum seekers, immigrants, when there's all this disinformation around about them committing crimes and things that is just not true in many cases. And so we were just talking about this, about the need for NGOs and especially humanitarian groups to also become much more sophisticated about these tools quickly, because it is putting people's lives at risk, not just the refugees and immigrants and asylum seekers themselves, of course, but also the aid workers who are trying to help them. I mean, they have had death threats in the NGO community because of this kind of an issue. But again, the research isn't there, the tools aren't there. I actually came back, I mean, this happened literally 3 weeks ago. I came back to our team and said, we really ought to think about designing a training program for other NGOs working on humanitarian issues about how they're supposed to deal with some of these issues because they are being threatened. And so I don't have any answers for you, but I'm really glad you're doing the research. And I think it's just another, I mean, every time I turn around, I feel like there's a new front in the war. And we're just so slow in responding. So that's why I came here. I want to encourage all of you to hurry up in your research and your research and your research. Hurry up, we need you.
Conscious of the time, speaking of hurrying up, we have two last questions here, so I think we should just gather both of them, and we'll try to make them relatively brief, and then Kristen can respond, and if you have any final words, and we'll
That's
wrap up.
fine. We
So,
have
right,
all the time.
this gentleman? Yep.
Yeah.
No, I think behind Ren, right?
I'm Hal Murray. I'm a retired computer guy. I have a not solid but discouraging data point. If you looked at the spam situation 10, 20 years ago, there was a big campaign of all we got to do is teach the users.
Right.
And there are all sorts of side comments along with half the people are dumber than average, and they keep breeding better idiots and all that sort of stuff. It's just it didn't work.
Actually, it's a great example because it was teach to users because the idea was we can't find the tech solution. But actually, we did find the tech solution because I don't get spam in my inbox at work anymore the way I used to. In the 90s, I used to come in and find a long string of spam emails. So we found a tech solution. I think with this example, one of the questions is it possible to find a tech solution? And I think so far there has been skepticism that we can, but I would love to be corrected because it's a much more elegant solution if we can find a tech solution the way we did with the spam.
A tech solution that doesn't impact their revenues.
And also doesn't squelch democratic free speech, because that's the other issue.
The spam that you don't get includes appeals from organizations sending out mass emails that arrive in the inbox of people that have political opinions different from yours and who mark it as spam. If you look in your spam folder, you'll find that.
Yeah, I just found out I got invited to a really important conference and I didn't even know it because it's apparently in my spam filter. So yeah.
Is this the conference hosted by a Nigerian prince?
No, it was actually this. It was
I got invited to that one like 65 times.
Better. It was the Skoll Global Forum, which I really ought to go to.
All right, gentleman back here, last one.
Yeah.
Last question. Great talk, Doctor. Can you talk about
Who are you?
Let us know who you are.
Oh, Mike, U.S. government. And can you talk a little bit about the distinction between disinformation and fake news?
That's a yeah, sure, yeah. Oh, and hate speech. Yeah, there are, I side because I find that there are definitions that smarter people than me have come up with, and I wish that I could remember them off the top of my head and just quote them to you, but here's my take on it. We actually try not to use the phrase fake news because it is very loaded, it is very emotional, it is very political, so actually my staff hate it when I use the word fake news. I tend to do it because it's the language that normal people use in their conversation, but I do think it's highly problematic because who gets to decide what's fake and not fake? And if you disagree with something, is it fake? So I even though you heard me use the term fake news, because it is in the public sphere and everyone uses it, I actually would argue that we probably shouldn't use it. Now, disinformation is intentionally targeted false information in order to achieve a desired objective. So that's how I would define disinformation, as opposed to misinformation, which can be I share some information just because I'm wrong. Whereas if I'm sharing disinformation, I am actively trying to get Colin to believe something by sharing him wrong information, rather than me just being ignorant. In terms of hate speech, usually hate speech is defined in terms of speech that is designed to elicit negative feelings towards an out group of some sort or another group. And so I think you ought to be a little bit careful with that word, and people have written volumes about what counts and doesn't count and how to define it. I would refer you to them, but that's sort of the colloquial way that I would define it. Did that answer your question?
No, I think I didn't phrase it quite right. I was more interested in the curriculum.
Oh, the curriculum. Oh, I'd have to get a little bit, I could be happy to put you in touch with our team who could answer more definitively, but usually it's about recognizing what is the agenda of this person or of this news story, of this person on my social media feed. What is their objective? Are they trying to get me to believe something about this group that is negative? And then, so a lot of the questions are about that, but there's a there's an unpacked version of this in the curriculum that if you have questions, I'd be happy to put you in touch with the team and they could kind of walk you through the longer version of that. But you have to summarize it somehow rather than like 16 different questions in a public talk.
So please join me in thanking Kristen for